how's it going? Thanks for stopping by. Today we're going to continue on with our Scott and Laci Peterson series. We're going to get into part 3 today. All right, so we're going to go over December 24th of 2002. This is the most hotly contested day of almost the whole case. I cannot stress to you how important it is to really look at everybody's different views on this and what's there, what isn't there. So let's get into it.
But to judge what is necessary to be told, it is necessary to see and hear all that is to be seen and heard.
December 24th, 2002. This is the day that really kicks off the search. I mean, it's the day where Laci went missing. December 23rd, remember, she saw her sister at the salon. She was seen out and about. There is a record of her, a solid record with solid witnesses that have been deemed 100% credible, like her sister. She had a phone call with her mom. On December 24th, all of the sightings of Laci really, they kind of went under the radar for a bit. And, there's different reasons for that. And we'll get into it a little bit later when we start really going far into the Laci sightings, but it's debated on whether they were actually real. That's true. It is true that it was debated on whether it was actually real or not, right? Like, that's not my opinion. That's literal fact. It's a little bit insulting to some of the people, it seems. I've seen some of the interviews where the neighbors are talking about when they saw her last or talking about seeing her walking with her dog. And this is something that not all of them really took kindly to. So Laci wakes up 7 a.m. because she's pregnant. She needs to eat like right away. So she went and she had a bowl of cereal herself. And Scott still laid in bed until about 8:30. Scott ends up getting out of bed around 8:30. He goes to the kitchen. He has a bowl of cereal and Laci's eating a piece of toast. When Scott finished eating with Laci, he went and he took a shower, and it's around 8:40 in the morning that there are logs on their computer of somebody using the computer, opening up Yahoo. There's a couple of like shopping links that had popped up for a sweater from Gap, and then there was a umbrella stand, like a sunflower umbrella stand. Laci was fond of sunflowers, so they worked at tying that to Laci. But then there was also Scott. His email was accessed on the computer around that same time. In Scott's email, it was a conversation about a golf bag. And then there also was a weather check that had happened. Because Scott's email was accessed and because the weather conditions were also being accessed, it's one of those debated things, like a lot of the little facts in this story. It's one of those debated things where people will point one way or another, and depending on how you feel about it, it could make or break the case for you. So while Scott's getting dressed, Laci's doing her hair the way that she had learned from her sister the day before, with the curling iron, doing the flip out style. It was popular back in the day. And she was, excitedly talking about what she had planned for the day. She was going to take Mackenzie out for a walk, and then she was going to go to the grocery store because she needed to grab some additional ingredients for this French toast dish that she was making for the Christmas brunch that they had planned the next day. It was one of those recipes that you have to let sit and marinate for quite some time. So she was really excited about it. After Scott gets dressed, he loads 3 patio umbrellas into the bed of his truck. He was planning on taking those to the warehouse to store them and then go about his day. Now, while he was doing this, one of the neighbors walked by, Kirsten Dempwolf, and he said hi to her. He waved hi. She said hi back, friendly as always, is what she reports. Before Scott left, he filled up the mop bucket for Lacey. One of the things that she had planned on doing was mopping the floor so that the Christmas brunch the next day would go smoother. Now, while they were going to be having dinner, Christmas Eve dinner at her parents' house, they were going to have Christmas brunch at Scott and Lacey's house. So she wanted to make sure that she had mopped up, and this was this is one of those situations where I can also again see both sides because Scott and Lacey had a housekeeper. Okay, and the housekeeper had been there just the day before and cleaned the house. She cleaned the floors. She used some water and pine sol, is what she says. And I can understand wanting to remop right before you have everybody over for a family dinner. I get that. I also understand, like, she's pregnant. She had been being told by her doctor that she needed to chill down, slow down, relax a little bit more, which, reportedly from everyone around her was difficult for Lacey. She still continued on walking Mackenzie and being more active than her doctor had wanted her to be in pregnancy. So, I mean, it happens. I've seen women like that, but you know, one of those one of those details that make or break it for some people, but for me, I see both sides on that one too. Scott had also reported that him and Lacey had been watching Martha Stewart. Now remember, Lacey loved Martha Stewart. So, I mean, it's like, well, yeah, of course Lacey would watch Martha Stewart, but what was actually on? Now, that day, Martha Stewart had been talking about several things, but she also had been talking about meringue. And Scott had said that Martha Stewart was talking about meringue that day. Now, this is one of those facts that wasn't actually represented properly, I think, because it sounds like the prosecution was trying to say, oh, well, they never talked about meringue that day. But, if you actually went back and watched more of the Martha Stewart video than they were referring to, she did end up talking about meringue. But I mean, for me, yeah, I get it. I get that Lacey would be watching it, but also, how hard is it to just turn on the TV? Either way, it's one of those details that I think is a wash, but it was a big point that the prosecution tried to hold on to. They just didn't have it reported quite right. Scott's warehouse was about 9 minutes away from his and Lacey's home. So he went there. He ended up logging in to his work computer from about 10:30 to 10:56. Now, while he's doing that, he's checking emails, and his time at his warehouse also included him looking up instructions on how to put together a tool that he had purchased. Scott also said before he left the warehouse, he had put the tool together, and when investigators went later on and looked at it, yeah, the tool was put together. So, while Scott was assembling that tool, he actually ended up cutting his finger on the edge of a toolbox, and he needed to go and grab napkins from his car. Now, this is really some of the only DNA evidence, or some of the only like forensic evidence that they pull from the case, because he dripped a drop of blood on the door of his truck. And I mean, they found it. They found his blood there from when he got the napkin to, take care of his cut, but they didn't find any of Lacey's DNA. So that's something that a lot of people point to. And if Lacey had been in that truck somewhere, where's the forensics on it? Scott talks about fishing in this trip, but then he also ends up talking about just really wanting to get the boat on the water. Now, all up to this point, Scott had been telling everyone that he was going to go golfing on Christmas Eve. Like, that was his plan for the day. He was going to go golfing. But a lot of people really find it very suspicious that he just switched to the Berkeley Marina, just like right then and there. So it's at this time that Scott decides he'd rather go and take the boat out on the water rather than go golfing, because he said it was too cold to go golfing. I don't know. it doesn't really make sense to me. And I mean, he had been telling everybody he was planning on going golfing. Now, some of the speculation that I've seen out there is that the whole reason that Scott hadn't really told anybody that he was going fishing is because he didn't want to go fishing with Ron Gransky. You know, you remember him? Lacey's stepfather? There is some kind of like I had seen a mention of it and I had to look into it more like what's going on with this. And I saw some transcripts of Ron Gransky talking about him and his fishing cuz he had gone fishing that same day too, but he went to a lake instead of to the Berkeley Marina. Now, it's kind of one of those things where it almost seems like the defense is pushing to say, well, Scott didn't want to go fishing with his father in law. He was not interested in going with Ron Gransky. So, yeah, he kept his possible idea of going to take that boat out and he kept the whole idea and letting the family know about the boat, with the exception of Lacey, from what they say, because Scott insists that Lacey knew about the boat. There also is a supposed witness that saw Lacey at the warehouse with Scott with the boat, remember? But the idea that Scott was really telling everybody he was going golfing was maybe he's trying to make sure that he doesn't get invited or doesn't feel obligated to invite Ron to go fishing. It's not my idea. I didn't come up with it, but I did see it. Like, I saw it and I had to investigate. And sure enough, there's some when they're having Ron testify at the trial, there's some back and forth about that. Scott reported that he left the warehouse around 11:18 and then he headed off to the Berkeley Marina. Now, this is about an hour and a half away from the warehouse, so quite a drive. Scott purchases a boat launch ticket and it's stamped as 12:54. Now, that's like the time that he gets in there and he goes and he gets the boat in the water. There are some talks about people looking at him and laughing at him because he had a difficult time getting the boat in the water. Um, these witnesses aren't 100% clear, but we'll talk about more on the witnesses a little bit later. Either way, Scott trolled around in the boat for a little bit. By his account, he had went about 2 miles out. He was by this island and he had seen trash and like a broken dock on it. So, no landing there. And then he realizes, oh no, I forgot my lures in my truck. And he doesn't, he's not successful at catching anything. It's debated on whether he actually even was fishing that day. Because if you follow the prosecutor's theory, according to the prosecutors, Scott had actually dumped Lacey at that time. So they theorized that instead of just having an innocent trip on the boat, what Scott did was he had tied Lacey to 4 homemade anchors. And these anchors were made of concrete out of like a Home Depot bucket. We'll talk about them more later in another part of this series, but that's what the prosecutors alleged. They alleged that that was when he dumped pregnant Lacey's body, and that was it. Scott's side, what they contend is just that. He just wanted to take the boat out and see how it went. And after that little bit of time, he goes, he pulls the boat back in, attaches it to the truck, and then he heads out. Scott estimated that he had been out for about 90 minutes, right? Now, he gets in his truck and he heads home. He actually calls Lacey and he leaves a voicemail. He mentions it's 2:15 and he tells her that he's not going to be able to go and get the basket that he told Lacey's sister that he would pick up for her. Remember the basket that Lacey's sister had gotten for Papa, their grandfather, Scott called Lacey, told her that, hey, it's 2:15. I'm not going to make it. Can you go pick up the basket? Scott also, there's phone records that show that Scott called her a couple of more times on the way back home, but he wasn't leaving voice messages. So he stops and gets gas, and then he goes back to the warehouse. He drops the boat off. Scott estimates that he got home somewhere between 4:30 and 4:45. Now, when he gets there, he goes in the backyard and he sees Mackenzie on his leash, and he takes Mackenzie's leash off, puts it on the table, and then he goes inside and starts to probably, I don't know, he's late for dinner at this point. They had been supposed to have met at 4 o'clock to go back for dinner with Lacey's parents. So, that's blown right there. He gets home at 4:30 and now he has to, get ready. And what does he do? He takes his clothes off because they're wet. He looks in the washer. For some reason, he takes a whole load of like rags that had been in there that the housekeeper had put on the dryer. There's talk about her putting them in the washer, but that was not something that she had testified to. She had testified that she actually had put them outside of the washer and that she assumed that Lacey had washed them, and Lacey was the one that washed those for her. Scott takes those out of the wash and then he puts his clothes into the wash and proceeds to wash them. Like he starts a load. He doesn't just leave them in there to be cleaned later. Now, if you ask me, if Scott thought that the housekeeper washed the rags, but it was actually Lacey, the whole idea of them not having been switched over, I would feel like that would be something that would point more to why didn't Lacey switch these over if she was the one that put them in? And I'm taking that from some of the testimony that came from the housekeeper. So, I mean, she had only visited their house 4 times prior to that, or 4 times in total. She had only visited their house 4 times in total. So it's, you know, one of those weird things. Maybe Scott thought she did that when it was actually Lacey. And why wouldn't Lacey switch them over? If Scott didn't realize it, I don't know if he would have switched them over. Switch over the laundry is basically what I'm saying. If you're going to be putting clothes in the washer, switch the ones that are in the washer to the dryer, Just something that I latched onto there. Important to me detail. Scott then grabs himself some leftover pizza from the night before. The pizza box was found out on the counter, and he grabs the pizza and, controversially, a glass of milk. I personally wouldn't go for this, but people really don't like that he had pizza and milk together. Like I said, I wouldn't go for it. I've never done it myself, but I've never thought, holy shit, what's wrong with someone drinking milk and pizza together? So, I don't know. That feels like drink whatever you want with your pizza. Gross, but you do you. When Scott was done freshening up, he goes and he decides that he's going to check the voicemails. Now, this isn't voicemails like the phones now. This is one of those voicemail boxes, we're talking early 2000s. People still had the landlines and they had the voicemail message boxes, and that's what they had. So he's listening to these, and then he hears the message from Ron. Okay, Ron had actually called to ask Scott and Lacey really, to bring some whipped cream over to their house. Because remember, they had planned to have dinner with Sharon and Ron that night. I know, the prosecutor, it's weird because they say he planned this, and, this is exactly what he meant to do. But then at the same time, they try to say that it was kind of unplanned because maybe Lacey found a photo of Amber and Scott. So to me, I feel like if he had been planning this, why do it on a day when you had dinner planned with her parents? You know, that feels like an oversight for me. And maybe he would just be cocky enough to do it. Like, oh yeah, I can get away with it. But he's either a mastermind or he's not. You know what I mean? And it's hard for me to wrap my mind around why do it when you know that you guys have a dinner with her parents. The weird date to pick to me, there's other days. Now, when Scott heard this message, this is what kind of rang the alarm bells for him. So he calls Sharon and Ron and he checks to see if Lacey's with them because Laci wasn't with him. Okay. So they let him know, like, no, she's not with us. So now they start looking, and Sharon is like talking about calling hospitals, and Scott's going over to the neighbors and he's checking with them. Now, originally, in one of the earlier interviews with Sharon, she says that Scott called because Lacey's car was there and her purse and keys were there, and he just wanted to see if Sharon had picked Laci up or like if everything was okay. And like later on, she throws in that he said the word missing. So I don't know. I'm sure that the feelings were running high at that time. It's frustrating to me to see stories change, but also like understandable when everybody's adrenaline is rushing and her pregnant daughter was missing and she never saw her again. So, yeah, I understand the emotion there and how, you know, things could change. Maybe she didn't register it at first because they came out for him. They supported Scott for quite a while until Amber Frey came out, but they supported him. So it's odd to me, Odd but understandable. Frustrating things, Like, oh, wouldn't it have been great if they had recorded their conversation? But who knows to record something like that? It'd be great if it was on tape, though. Like, if this happened nowadays, there are so many Ring doorbell cameras, it would not be so unsure. The thing that is so frustrating about this case is all of the things that we're not 100% sure on because there's conflicting witnesses, there's conflicting evidence. It's just one of those things. So, Scott had called Ron and Sharon at 5:17. Then he starts going to the neighbors' houses, asking them if they had seen Laci or if Laci was over there. He had not been successful. So he goes back home and he calls Sharon and Ron again, and then they spring into action too. So Ron calls 911 and Sharon and Scott actually they start trying to look around the neighborhood. They look around the path. They go to the park where Laci normally walked Mackenzie, and they're trying to trace her steps. Scott has Mackenzie with them, and they're looking, they're thinking maybe she fell, maybe she got hurt, something like that. And they're hoping that they just find her along the path. Now the officers respond, three of them respond, and they end up meeting Scott and Sharon at the park. Now they go back to the Peterson house and they start looking around. They ask Scott if they can look around the house, and they do. They go around the house once, and after this, Scott kind of starts getting weird vibes, and he hears them talk about how they need a homicide detective, which, you know, that's got to be terrifying. Whether you're innocent or you're guilty at that point in time, it's terrifying in one way or another. When they had decided that they needed a homicide detective, the next homicide detective that was up for a case was actually Detective Al Brocchini, and he is indisputably really the reason that Scott got convicted. Like, he is one of the major reasons why, because after his interactions with Scott, he was not a fan. He had actually been a little bit away from the area, so it took him a little bit longer to respond. And before he was able to respond, the officers again do another search of the home. And they're not seeing like blood spots or whatever it may be. There's nothing that seems out of place. In this second search, there was one thing that kind of popped out at the officers, and they said the rug by the back door had been pushed like all the way up against the back door. Now, Scott played this off as, it was the animals playing around it, and then he straightened it out. I don't know. Animals mess up rugs, but also the idea is that it's pushed all the way to the door because the idea is he dragged something over that, and the prosecutors are thinking he dragged Laci over that, but, he just figured it was the animals, and, I mean, I've definitely seen animals mess up rugs, so, but he fixed it, and there's not, like, a picture of it for you to see what it looked like. This was something that the officers noted in the second time they went through the house, which, if they're thinking something's a crime scene, it probably should have immediately been vacated and combed over for forensics, but, what do you do? Can't go back and fix that issue, so we move on. Scott had also provided the responding officers his Berkeley Marina receipt, and, it doesn't surprise me he could have just had it in his wallet and had his wallet in his pants. Like he had changed his clothes and washed his clothes, don't forget that, but, he had the receipt right there and ready, so to me, you throw it in your wallet, whatever, you take it with your change. I don't put your card back in your wallet and throw your receipt in there. It it's not a big deal to me that he still had it 4 or 5 hours later, is what I'm saying. There's some people who find that really problematic that he had it and had it ready, but feels like a non-issue to me. Detective Brocchini got there around 9:30, and he does a third walkthrough through the house, and he talks to the officers, and he kind of gets caught up on everything that's going on. And then Detective Brocchini ends up doing a fourth walkthrough, and in this walkthrough, that's where he notices Lacey's purse and keys, and this is the walkthrough that he does with Scott, and the vibes aren't vibing, right? Like Detective Brocchini just is not feeling like Scott is acting appropriately. Really, I mean, it seems like all the officers didn't feel like Scott was acting the way that they felt he should have with his wife missing like this. One thing that people like to know, and I don't know if it's because we're so accustomed to having our phones on us all the time nowadays, but some people like to know about how Lacey had her phone was left in the car. They talk about keys, purse, and then they say, well, her phone was left in the car. But having a phone in the car back then wasn't that uncommon. The phones were not like how they are today. We're talking pixelated screens, okay? There was a lot of people didn't carry their phones around like that. So I always just really consider the phone a non-issue too, but it's just worth bringing up because it's something that a lot of people point to. This day, like there's an audio recording of Scott talking, and he's talking about how this is the day that he felt like the police were tunnel visioning on him. Now, I feel like the statement is so odd to me just for the simple fact that if he really did feel in that present moment that the police were tunnel visioning him, his actions were really weird afterward. I'm just like, if somebody was like, "Yeah, the police are watching me," it's just a lot of his behaviors are weird, and, we'll get into that in the next one, but he just makes some choices, all right? And I've got a lot of questions about them. After the searches of the house, Detective Brocchini goes to the warehouse with Scott, and he searches the warehouse. He does, like a rough search, kind of like the rough searches of the house that they did. So he like drives his patrol car to the warehouse door. Like it was the big like garage door type thing. He goes to that door and he's shining the police light in there because he's taking the word. He was told that the electricity was out there. So he's taking the word of Scott and he's like using the car light to light everything. And I'm not sure exactly why there was talk about the power being out, especially because he had been using the computer there. I don't know if it was just like a night thing that they did or what it was, but according to Al Brocchini, he just used his police patrol light and he looked in there. He saw a homemade anchor in the boat, but he didn't see anything really like of note. There wasn't, like if you're expecting a spot of blood, if you're expecting like blood splatters, pools of blood, like signs of a struggle, none of that was found, either at the house or at the warehouse. None of it. So that I think initially that was kind of what they were thinking they were looking for, especially because they knew a confirmed last time of Lacey being seen was at the salon with her sister the night before, and the confirmed last discussion with Lacey that wasn't Scott was with Sharon the night before around 8:15. So they kind of have a timeline and they're thinking, there's no way that he could have gotten away with doing all this and not leaving any evidence. There is some talk about a bleach smell at the house, but it's not noted properly in the police reports. It's kind of like they were gossiping about it, but they didn't actually write it in the police reports, and that was an issue in itself too. It was around midnight to 1 a.m. that Detective Brocchini took Scott to the police station, and that was where they're having their discussion about, what happened. They're questioning him, and it's on video, and you can see him there, and he's sitting in more of this relaxed devil may care attitude that rubs a lot of people the wrong way because he just looks so casual for something that you would think he would be more stressed out. You would hope that he would be as upset about this because it's his wife, his baby, just like everything turning upside down. I'm sure he was probably pretty tired at this time, and what a terrible, awful day to have. Like if Scott truly like is innocent of everything, can you imagine how exhausting a day like that would have been? So they test Scott's hand for gunshot residue and they ask him if he can do a polygraph. He's kind of hesitant, he's tired, and his dad actually didn't think it was a good idea. His dad really, he sums up what happens with a lot of polygraph tests in general, just in cases in general. Like if the results come back to show that the person really has nothing to hide based on the results, like if it comes back all clean, you don't really hear about it much, but if it comes back dirty, like they were lying about something, then you hear about it. But then they're also not acceptable in court. So it's just, why do we even do? I get we do them to like freak people out. It's more of a psychological thing, I think, than anything. And, I don't put much stock into that kind of stuff. And I think, they're right. I think that happens in a lot of cases to demonstrate that that's what happens. So, you know, who knows? Either way, the polygraph test wasn't taken, but the gunshot residue test on his hands, that's all taken care of. Al Brocchini is telling him, hey, we want to discount you as being the suspect. They don't want him to be the suspect. If you buy into the tunnel vision, all of that, yeah, they want him to be the dude, right? They want to get that out of the way. Scott was not arrested at this point. At this point, he was able to go back home and, that's what he did. But it was a very action-packed December 24th, 2002. And at the very end of the day, it's just the question that is left on that day is, where is Lacey for everyone? So we are going to cut it off here with Scott not being arrested. He just got questioned. We went over all the information about December 24th. There are certain things that we'll go back and we'll dig a little bit more into as we get, toward that part in the series. But for now, thank you for coming back by. I appreciate your support. I hope you join us next time when we pick up. We're going to talk about what happened after this day, how the media evolved, what was Scott's demeanor and go from there. So thanks for again for stopping by and have a good one. Thank you. Bye.